When Jasmine Crockett challenged Senator Tom Cotton for labeling slavery a necessary evil, the hearing did more than stir anger. It unleashed a fierce struggle over truth, history, and authority. Armed with 619 pages of hidden records and the testimony of a 98-year-old woman whose ancestor was once sold to Cotton's family, Crockett shattered decades of silence in just 5 minutes. The footage exploded online within 48 hours, amassing millions of views, splitting the nation, exposing a buried lie, and compelling Congress to confront what it had long tried to suppress. But what exactly did Jasmine say that rocked the system to its foundation? Stay tuned. This story demands your full attention. Room 214 resembled a fortress more than a hearing chamber, sealed tight, eerily quiet, and heavy with tension. The walls offered no comfort, only the stark pressure of anticipation. This wasn't merely another political clash, it was a confrontation between memory and fiction, reality and denial. Overhead, fluorescent lights hummed softly, as if hesitant to illuminate what was about to unfold. Tom Cotton strode in first, tailored suit, chiseled features, exuding the quiet confidence of someone rarely questioned. Flanked by Republican senators like guards, he appeared not anxious, but assured. To him, this hearing was a routine step, a chance to cement control and reshape history with smooth rhetoric and unshakable resolve. Then Jasmine Crockett entered through a side door. No fanfare, only impact. She wore a black blazer adorned with a Harriet Tubman pin that shone like a challenge. In her hands, she carried a 619-page dossier, heavy with the burden of forgotten truths. She didn't speak. Her presence spoke for her. Each step declared, "I've fought for truths you've only encountered in books." When she took her seat, a hush descended like a judgment. Cotton glanced her way, but this time, his usual playbook wouldn't shield him. Jasmine's folder remained closed for the moment, but its contents and the fire in her steady gaze signaled one truth. This wasn't a hearing. It was a confrontation with history itself. As the gavel's echo dissolved into the tense silence of room 214, a screen behind the senators flickered to life. Not with data, but with a memory. A 4-year-old video, grainy from endless shares, filled the room with a voice too composed for its devastating words. The founders saw slavery as a necessary evil, the bedrock of the Union, Tom Cotton declared in July 2020, standing erect before a line of flags and a silent backdrop. His tone was calculated, precise, like a blade's edge. There was no pause, no nod to the suffering. Just a statement that hit like a weight in the chests of every American still bearing the scars of enslavement, whether through ancestry or lived reality. He didn't waver, and that, perhaps, was the most perilous part. To him, this wasn't a divisive claim. It was gospel. The clip ran its full 15 seconds, a moment history would recall more vividly than some entire presidencies. It had faded from major news outlets back then, but it never truly vanished. It lingered in phone screens, classroom discussions, and whispered exchanges among educators, too cautious to speak freely, until it resurfaced. A month before this hearing, Cotton pushed a bill to ban the 1619 Project, a Pulitzer Prize-winning effort to reframe U.S. history through the lens of slavery's impact from schools nationwide. His rationale? The project was ideologically poisonous, a betrayal of patriotic values. But when the video reemerged alongside his legislation, it didn't just rekindle an old spark, it ignited a wildfire. The outrage spread faster than any political campaign, first on Twitter, then TikTok, then spilling into the streets. A Chicago high school student stood outside her school with a cardboard sign reading, "Necessary for who, Senator?" That image was shared over 11 million times in a single weekend. Universities halted classes for teach-ins. Churches held prayer vigils. Parents, educators, students, veterans, all posing the same question. How could a nation claim moral legitimacy while justifying its gravest sin as essential to its foundation? protests erupted across more than 30 states. Not chaotic, but disciplined. Spanning generations, woven with sorrow. Elderly black veterans marched alongside Gen Z activists. Descendants of the enslaved walked arm in arm with Holocaust survivors. At the heart of it all, a phrase became a rallying cry, then a movement. Necessary for who? The question didn't just challenge Cotton. It interrogated the entire system he represented. From her district office in South Dallas, Jasmine Crockett observed the unfolding drama on her phone, on television, through her window. She didn't just witness the anger. She felt the weariness beneath it, the kind that comes from knowing the battle never truly ends, only changes its guise. She heard from teachers disciplined for teaching unfiltered history. She spoke with students puzzled by why their pain was labeled unpatriotic. And she listened to a mother whose 10-year-old came home in tears because his textbook referred to enslaved Africans as workers. That was the moment Jasmine refused to remain a bystander. She didn't request the hearing. She insisted on it, not for her own sake, but for every voice deemed too bold, too furious, too inconvenient for America's sanitized narrative. When Congress finally agreed to hold this private hearing on the educational and historical ramifications of Cotton's words and proposed law, Jasmine didn't prepare a mere legal argument. She crafted a confrontation with destiny. The stakes weren't scholarly, they were fundamental. This wasn't about a single statement. It was about who holds the pen to write the words that shape a nation's identity. As the screen darkened and Cotton's own words faded into silence, he didn't back down. He leaned in, as if the video, the protests, the pain only reinforced his stance. History, he declared, his voice firm like a courtroom ruling, should not be colored by sentiment. His gaze swept the room, pausing briefly on Jasmine Crockett with a detached chill. We must teach facts, not emotions, he pressed on. America emerged from the embers of its flaws. That's not a blemish to wipe away. It's a legacy to embrace. His words, framing the agony of millions as a necessary but regrettable chapter in a grand saga, landed like a slow-burning detonation. He spoke of resilience as if he owned it, of scars as if he could define them. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the room might buy into it, that the steady cadence of his eloquence could overpower the messiness of truth. But Jasmine didn't flinch. Her jaw clenched, her grip tightened on her folder's edge. Because Cotton wasn't just defending a phrase. He was wielding distance. Distance from suffering, from blood, from names erased from history books because they perished in obscurity. His reasoning was sleek, yes, but empty. A logic that reduces shackles to symbols and plantations to economic asides. He called it impartiality, but Jasmine saw through it. It was polished injustice, systemic apathy cloaked in elite eloquence. Sitting across from him, she felt the full gravity of the moment. Not a debate, but a war where truth itself stood trial. The silence after Cotton's final words didn't linger. It broke softly, decisively, like a crack in glass. Jasmine Crockett shifted in her chair, not from unease, but with the focus of someone ready to unleash truth amid complacency. She didn't shout. She didn't need volume. She had substance. You don't grasp it, she said, her voice steady and resolute, each word falling like a pebble into calm waters. America wasn't built despite slavery. It was built because of it. The room held its breath. Her words didn't just counter Cotton, they unmasked him, peeling away his polished rationale to reveal the reality he sought to obscure. This nation's foundation wasn't liberty, but ownership, human ownership. She didn't waver. She didn't move. Her gaze fixed on his with the quiet intensity only rage can muster. You claim we've advanced, she continued, her tone firm, yet weighted, like a final judgment. But some of us are still clawing. Our way out of unmarked graves we never had time to grieve. And you, perched above it all, call it progress, because you never had to break the soil. Her words sparked the air like a match on tinder, restrained, exact, yet fiercely potent. Cotton's expression didn't shift, But his silence grew heavier. It was no longer the silence of assurance. It was the pause of someone recalculating. One too late and too fragile. The room's tension crackled like static. Aides looked up but stayed mute. Some senators leaned back, others forward, torn between withdrawal and engagement. Jasmine pressed on, not for theatrics, but for precision. You think admitting pain is frailty? That teaching truth divides us? But what's truly divisive? Sharing the whole story or clinging to a sanitized version? She paused, letting the question linger like a sword held aloft. You act as if history is impartial, but impartiality only shields those in power. Then, quieter but piercing. Every day, I navigate institutions not designed for me. I speak in chambers that once barred my existence. I know precisely what this nation overcame, and what it chose to preserve. Her voice didn't tremble. It clarified. It cut through the air like cold, light-breaking fog. This wasn't defiance, it was restoration. And everyone in that room, every aide, every senator, every camera feed secretly running outside, felt it. Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to win an argument. She was here to make sure no one left this room untouched by the weight of what America refuses to face. The room didn't erupt. It froze. Because when someone speaks the truth with nothing to gain and everything to lose, silence becomes the loudest sound in the world. The silence that followed Jasmine's last words wasn't empty. It was full. Full of things never spoken aloud in rooms like this. And she knew it was time. With steady hands, she reached for the manila folder in front of her. Thick, worn, its edges dulled from months of preparation, years of history, and generations of silence. She opened it without a sound, like someone opening a casket. Not of death, but of truth long buried. These are letters, she said softly, written by people who were never meant to be remembered, let alone read aloud in this building. She looked up, locking eyes with the Senate panel. Letters from the enslaved, written in the late 1700s, addressed to the very men who built this nation and called it free. The room leaned in, consciously or not. She selected one page, its corner torn, the signature smudged with what looked like dirt, but might have been dried sweat. Holding it up with reverence, she read, "If we are necessary to your nation, then our suffering must be your foundation." Her voice was clear, low, measured. Every syllable carried the weight of someone who understood she wasn't reading history. She was unearthing it. You trade our bodies and speak of liberty. You break our backs and praise the strength of the Republic. You silence our names, then say history was silent. She paused, letting the air absorb the words. This was written in 1790, not by a scholar, not by a general, by a man who was only given a number on a plantation ledger, but still dared to write to Congress. The room transformed. The temperature didn't drop, but it felt colder. Cotton didn't move, but the stillness around him shifted from control to calculation. One senator on the far right of the dais sat back and rubbed his temple. Another tapped their pen, then stopped. The rhythm of power had been interrupted. Jasmine lowered the letter slowly, her fingers lingering on the parchment like she was setting it down in the soil it came from. She didn't embellish. She didn't explain. Because the truth doesn't need permission to stand. Cotton's eyes were fixed on the page now, not with curiosity, but with something harder to define. Disbelief, perhaps, or the dawning awareness that what he had dismissed as abstract had just spoken with a human voice. After a moment, he cleared his throat sharply, audibly like trying to reclaim the floor. He adjusted the mic, sat up straighter, and then he began to speak, not with anger, but with forced control. But the cadence was different now, offbeat. His words no longer dropped with authority. They landed with hesitation, because no matter what he said next, it would now exist in the shadow of that letter, a voice from the grave that refused to be buried again. But Cotton wasn't finished. The letter had landed hard, But he had come prepared with something darker than denial, the tactic of deflection. As Jasmine lowered the fragile parchment back into its folder, he leaned forward and reached beneath his own stack of papers. His movements were crisp, deliberate, like a man about to pull a trigger he believed would end the argument. "If we're going to talk about the roots of this nation," he said, voice tighter now, each word clipped like a marching order, "then let's also talk about who's trying to rewrite it." He pulled out a stapled packet and slapped it onto the desk, the echo sharp in the quiet room. "The Congresswoman's office," he began, eyes locked on the panel, "not on her, has received significant financial support from the New American Legacy Foundation, a group repeatedly condemned for promoting historical revisionism and anti-American narratives." He let the accusation sit, heavy and coiled. He didn't look at Jasmine. He looked at the room, the press, the public. He wasn't speaking to her. He was performing the discrediting of her. "Let's not pretend this hearing is about truth," he continued, tone rising just enough to slice through the tension. "When the very foundation of her argument is funded by those who profit from division. She talks about letters, suffering, history. But what she's really doing is turning inherited trauma into political capital." There was a shift in the room, a flicker of uncertainty, not belief, but attention. Cotton smelled it and pressed harder. "You don't fight for justice by cashing checks from organizations that vilify the founding of this country. You don't honor the past by manipulating it into a campaign strategy." And with that, he sat back, not relaxed, but calculated. He had launched his counterstrike, not with fact, but with implication, because implication didn't need to be proven, only planted. It didn't matter that the foundation in question had also funded bipartisan historical literacy programs. It didn't matter that the accusation was wrapped in political theater. What mattered was that he'd painted Jasmine as compromised, conflicted, opportunistic in a room that measured everything in perception. That was enough to wound, even if it wasn't enough to win. Jasmine didn't look away, but she could feel it. The weight of being a black woman speaking hard truths in a chamber designed to mute them. The burden of being told that pain, when it came from her lineage, was suspicious. She wasn't just being questioned. She was being framed. Not as a witness, but as a threat. Not as a voice of history, but as a distortion of it. And that, more than the accusation itself, was the cruelty. Because the injustice wasn't only in what Cotton said. It was in how quickly the room was willing to listen. The moment hung heavy, like the pause between lightning and thunder, charged, inevitable. Tom Cotton's words still lingered in the air, his accusations sharpened to wound, not to argue. But Jasmine Crockett didn't look away. She didn't blink. Her silence wasn't hesitation. It was preparation. She leaned forward, the weight of generations, behind her, and spoke, not like someone defending herself, but like someone reclaiming a ground she never should have had to fight for. "If pain is the only political capital this country ever handed me," she said, her voice calm and controlled, but burning with something deeper, "then I will spend it with purpose, not performance." She let that land before continuing. "Because, unlike you, I don't need to rewrite history to make it serve me. I carry it with me. I am the consequence of it." There was no performance in her posture, no raised voice, just truth leveled with precision. "I didn't build a career out of grievance," she continued, her tone tightening like a drawstring. "I built a platform out of absence, out of names no one ever taught, out of documents no one ever cited, out of pain that was passed down, not as anger, but as warning." Her words didn't rise. They deepened, gained gravity. "You want to talk about legacy. Mine isn't carved in marble. It's stitched into death records, auction logs, court transcripts where justice never came." She paused, eyes still locked on his. "So, if you think I'm here to win sympathy, you've already misunderstood me. I'm not here to be understood. I'm here because someone has to say what history refused to." The room didn't shift. It held still because there was nowhere for the tension to go. Jasmine didn't ask for validation. She didn't seek applause. Her voice was too full for that, too full of what was never allowed to be said before. She had been called radical, ungrateful, divisive. But in this moment, she wasn't any of those things. She was undeniable. And her response wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a mirror held up to a room that had too long benefited from looking away. And just when it seemed Jasmine Crockett had said everything that needed to be said, she reached for a weapon far more powerful than rhetoric: memory made flesh. She stood slowly, but with conviction, and said evenly, "Madame Chère, I'd like to call one final witness." The room stirred, not with noise, but with anticipation. From the side door, flanked by 2 congressional aides, Mrs. Elsie Freeman entered. A 98-year-old woman whose presence silenced the room more effectively than any gavel. She walked slowly, leaning on a cane carved from dark wood, her steps careful but unshaken. Her face, lined with time, held no fear, only clarity. Draped across her shoulders was a navy wool shawl, and in her arms she carried a small, leather-bound book. It wasn't a prop. It was evidence, a family record written by hands that had never expected justice, but preserved the truth anyway. As Mrs. Freeman was seated and the microphone adjusted, the room instinctively leaned in. She opened the book to a page marked by a threadbare ribbon, her fingers trembling but precise. Then she read, softly at first, but with each word gaining power. "Cotton Family Ledger, Georgia Estate, June 12th, 1812. One Negro boy, approximately 14, renamed item number 7. The line landed like a slap, short, brutal, undeniable. The room froze. The senators, who moments ago sparred with facts and posturing, now sat immobilized by a single sentence that carried the weight of something America still hadn't fully faced. She paused, eyes lifting from the page to find Tom Cotton directly. There was no hate in her gaze, just a fierce, quiet knowing. "That boy," she said, "was my great-grandfather Samuel. Born free, taken, sold, stripped of his name, and given a number by your family." Cotton's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. Not here, not now. Freeman's voice trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the sheer force of restraint. "You speak of legacy, Senator. Mine begins on a ledger. Yours begins in the signature that wrote him down." She leaned closer to the mic, her tone now steady, deliberate. "You called slavery a necessary evil, but to us it wasn't a chapter. It was a sentence, generations long." Another pause. "Your ancestors thought we were necessary, but never once did they think we were people." The line hit hard. It didn't rise. It settled like weight across the room. Cotton stared ahead, unreadable. But around him, senators sat with eyes lowered, some clasping their hands, others blinking rapidly, as if trying to process not just the moment, but the implications of having to carry it home. In that minute, the narrative shifted, not with anger, not with fire, but with something far more difficult to resist. A living reminder that history isn't over just because the textbook stopped writing it. And Jasmine Crockett didn't say a word as Mrs. Freeman closed her book. She didn't need to. The testimony had already said everything America needed to hear, but had refused to listen to for centuries. The room had already shifted, its moral gravity altered by the quiet dignity of Mrs. Freeman's testimony. But what came next revealed not just discomfort in Senator Tom Cotton's eyes, but something far more telling: fear. Not of Jasmine Crockett, not of political defeat, but of being seen without the armor of controlled narrative. He shifted in his seat, knuckles whitening around the base of his microphone. Then, without warning, his voice sliced through the tension, sharp and rising. "Enough." The word wasn't directed at Jasmine. It was directed at the space she had created, the truth she had made impossible to unhear. "This entire hearing has been a performance, a partisan stunt orchestrated by the far left," he said, his voice quivering. Not with emotion, but with the strain of holding on to authority that was slipping from his hands. He kept going, faster now, like a man outrunning his own doubt. I won't sit here and be lectured by people who think America's sins are greater than its strengths, who twist our founding principles into weapons. He waved a dismissive hand toward the folder on the desk, toward the witness chair Mrs. Freeman had just vacated. This is not history. This is theater, selective outrage packaged for media headlines. But something about his words didn't land the way they once did. There was no surge of validation from his colleagues, no approving nods, only silence and the distant clicking of staffers refreshing their screens. Because while Cotton raged, the real headline was already breaking. One aide, barely able to hide his panic, slipped a phone toward a senior staffer on the Republican side. Another passed a printed page to the committee chair. Jasmine saw it happen. She didn't ask what it was. She already knew. It was the moment she had been warned might come, the moment where truth stopped knocking and kicked the damn door in. The email had leaked, a confidential internal memo from Cotton's own legislative director, dated 6 months earlier, now public. The subject line read like something pulled from a strategy playbook, not a Senate office. Narrative Management, Education Messaging Framework. In it, the language was as plain as it was damning. We must present the removal of the 1619 Project as a moral obligation, position the initiative as a threat to Western stability, frame history education through a lens of cohesion, not division. Those weren't academic objections. They were talking points crafted to shape belief, to preserve dominance under the Awenau'i banner of unity. And for once, Tom Cotton had nothing left to say. He blinked, once, twice. The printout was placed in front of him by one of his own. His lips parted, searching for the first word of a rebuttal, but all that came out was a shallow breath. The unraveling had begun, and it wasn't loud. It was quiet, humiliating in its precision. The very foundation of his argument, his defense of objective history, his warning about ideological distortion, had been undercut by his own words, written behind closed doors, never meant to be read by the public he claimed to serve. The chairwoman's voice broke through, calm but piercing. Senator Cotton, the committee has received this document from multiple outlets. Would you like to clarify the phrase, and I quote, controlling narrative flow to reinforce national identity? The sentence echoed across the marble chamber like a dropped gavel. Cotton looked up, but the bravado was gone. The script he had, so carefully followed, had turned on him. And now, in the very room he thought he could dominate with policy and polished indignation, he found himself exposed, cornered not by political opponents, but by his own strategy laid bare. Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was no longer a pause. It was a boundary. She sat still, composed, her hands resting over the folder, like someone who had carried its weight long before the hearing had begun. She watched, not with triumph, but with the unshakable awareness of someone who had seen this kind of unraveling before, when the machinery of power is forced to look in a mirror, and all its contradictions are suddenly visible. Cotton reached for his water. His hands trembled. Around him, senators glanced at one another, some with discomfort, others with calculation, but no one came to his defense. No one interrupted. The performance he had accused others of staging had collapsed into something far less theatrical and far more revealing. The truth of how far some would go to protect a version of history that doesn't belong to them, but works for them. And Jasmine remained quiet, because in that moment, silence spoke louder than outrage. It said this was, never about winning the argument. This was about exposing the architecture of denial. And, piece by piece, it was crumbling right in front of him. The room had settled into the kind of silence that doesn't invite recovery. It demands reflection. Tom Cotton sat frozen. The documents had been read. The mask had slipped. And for a moment, it seemed the hearing might end. Not with a vote, but with something quieter and far more permanent. A reckoning. Eyes weren't on him anymore. They were on the woman who hadn't just survived his attacks, but dismantled the scaffolding he'd built around them. And then Jasmine Crockett stood. No fanfare, No announcement, no shifting of papers, no glance at notes. She didn't reach for the binder she had carried with her since the start. She didn't lean on charts, or statistics, or digital evidence. She stood exactly as she was, unarmed but unafraid. Her blazer still pinned with the image of Harriet Tubman, her stance unshaken. And when she opened her mouth, her voice carried. With it, not the formality of debate, but the fire of testimony. Not a politician making a point, but a woman making history answer for itself. "I came here today," she said, her tone clear and steady, "not to perform, not to posture, but to confront a truth this body has evaded for far too long." Her eyes never left Cotton. "When a man calls evil necessary," she continued, her voice unflinching, "then it becomes necessary to call that man into the light." No one moved. Not a cough, not a paper shuffle, not even the usual scribble of a stenographer. Cotton blinked, visibly tense, as if bracing for a second blow, but it never came in the way he expected. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't pace. She let each sentence breathe like a drumbeat, and that somehow made it hit harder. "Senator Cotton, you stood on this floor and called slavery a necessary evil, as if our ancestors were sacrifices, not stolen lives, as if their backs were bricks in some glorious structure instead of open wounds that never fully closed." Her voice didn't waver, but there was pain in it. Not for herself, but for what she carried. And everyone in that chamber could feel it. Not sympathy. Something heavier. Something that could not be argued with because it was lived. "You said you're here to protect America," she said, the words measured and deliberate. "But what version of America are you defending exactly? The one in which a boy named Samuel Freeman could be sold as item number 7? The one where we remove stories that don't flatter the victors? The one where history is shaped to comfort the comfortable?" She took a step forward. Not toward Cotton, but toward the center of the room, into the light pouring down from above. "You see, the difference between you and me," she said, "is not patriotism. We both love this country, but I don't love it for the myths it tells. I love it for the fight it still requires." And then she turned fully to him, her voice still soft, but cutting with absolute precision. "You're not just wrong about history, Senator. You're afraid of it." That sentence didn't echo. It pierced. The room exhaled, like it had been holding its breath. Cotton didn't look away, but his expression shifted. Not anger, not defiance, something closer to unease. He knew that line would follow him. It was already being clipped, captioned, posted, looped. "Still," he responded, out of instinct, out of desperation, maybe both. "I protect America," he said, his voice clipped, the edge blunted by fatigue. It was supposed to sound resolute, but it didn't land like a statement of strength. It landed like a defense, and Jasmine knew it. "I do too," she answered without pause. Her voice was calm, earnest, true. "But I don't get to pick the easy parts to protect. I protect the ugly parts, the buried parts, the parts you would rather burn than teach." Now, her words turned from the man to the institution around him. She wasn't just addressing Cotton anymore. She was addressing every lawmaker, every official, every person who had ever sat in that chamber and called themselves a steward of the American story. You want to teach pride without pain, triumph without trauma. You want a version of America that looks clean on a bumper sticker but bleeds the moment you touch it. That's not patriotism. That's denial in a flag pin. Her voice was rising now, not in volume, but in temperature. Not loud, but hot, like steel fresh from the forge. "And the people I represent," she said, eyes scanning the room, "we live in what your history lessons leave out. We walk through institutions still shaped by that eraser. We read textbooks where our stories are footnotes, if they exist at all. And when we speak up, we're told we're ungrateful. When we testify, we're told we're theatrical." She paused just for a breath, then quieter. "Senator Cotton, the most dangerous thing you said today wasn't that slavery was necessary. It's that you still think it was strategic, that in some twisted calculus, what was done to us helped make this nation great. She took another step forward, her body now cast in the central light above the witness table. No spotlight, just sunlight from the chamber skylight window, pure, silent, impartial. You think I speak from anger? I speak from inheritance. I speak because silence has already done enough damage. I speak because my ancestors wrote letters that were never answered, screamed into fields no one walked back into, and died without a grave that bore their names. She looked back at Cotton one last time. You inherited comfort. I inherited consequences. But you do not get to weaponize my inheritance against me. And then she stepped back slowly, deliberately, not with the finality of someone done speaking, but with the restraint of someone who knew there was nothing left to say that wouldn't dilute what had already been spoken. The room was silent, truly silent, not out of courtesy, but out of awe. Even the cameras, those ever-hungry eyes of media, seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether what had just happened could even be reduced to sound bites. Cotton didn't speak again, not because he wasn't allowed, but because any word he might have offered would have echoed hollow in the wake of something real. And Jasmine Crockett, standing alone without a teleprompter, without a consultant, without a carefully crafted slogan, had done what centuries of hearings, books, and briefings had failed to do in that very room. She had told the truth, not to win a debate, but to make sure that, for once, the record would reflect the blood in the soil. But truth, as Jasmine Crockett knew too well, doesn't land in a vacuum. It lands in a battlefield. And the moment her words left that hearing room, they didn't travel gently. They ignited, they fractured, they polarized. Because in today's America, even truth has to choose a side. By the time Jasmine stepped out into the hallway, flanked by aides who wore the stunned look of people trying to process history in real time, the world had already begun carving her into myth or tearing her down. Her phone buzzed in short, relentless bursts. Screens across Capitol Hill lit up with breaking headlines. And less than 10 minutes after the hearing adjourned, the media machine roared to life. Fox News opened the floodgates first. The Chiron was blunt. Crockett's theatrics, radical left hijacks historical debate. Tucker Carlson's replacement host called her the latest in a long line of grievance politicians, claiming she was weaponizing identity to dismantle unity. Sound bites of her most searing lines, "You're afraid of history," and "I don't get to choose the easy parts to protect," were looped out of context, framed as evidence of woke extremism, as if acknowledging the pain. Of the past was now an act of treason. They didn't show Mrs. Elsie Freeman. They didn't quote the ledger. They didn't mention the leaked email. Instead, they zoomed in on Jasmine's face mid-sentence, jaw set, eyes locked, a moment of controlled fury, and painted it as unhinged rage, as if her composure was threatening, as if her truth-telling was violence. The panelists nodded in unison, the ticker rolled, and the verdict was clear. Cotton was cast as the victim, Jasmine, the aggressor. But across the media divide, another narrative had taken root, and it was growing fast. On MSNBC, the coverage struck a different chord. Rachel Maddow opened the segment with her usual deliberate intensity. Today, a congressional hearing on education policy became something more than political posturing. It became personal. It became historic. A video clip played of Jasmine, standing, no papers in hand, her voice clear as glass. "You're not just wrong about history, you're afraid of it." Then came the headline, stark in its simplicity, "The Woman Who Shook History." It wasn't just a segment, it was a moment. Social media seized it like oxygen meeting fire. Hashtags exploded. Truth doesn't flinch. Item number 7. Necessary for who? Jasmine Crockett. Once here. On TikTok, young black women stitched videos of their grandmothers watching the hearing replay with trembling hands. On Instagram, classrooms in Detroit, Atlanta, Oakland, and Baton Rouge posted chalkboards scrawled with Jasmine's final line, "I protect the parts that make us honest." Still, the storm was far from one-sided. The Daily Wire ran an op-ed titled, "Crockett's Cultural Coup: Why the Left's War on History is the Real Threat." They accused her of performing pain, of turning national memory into tribal currency. Ben Shapiro called her speech dangerous moral absolutism. Candace Owens tweeted that Jasmine was auditioning for a Netflix miniseries, not serving the American people. And in one particularly viral segment, a Fox contributor mocked her for quoting no founding documents, no constitution, no Federalist Papers, just emotion and identity. Of course, they omitted that she brought letters from enslaved people, which predated the Constitution's ratification by over a decade. Meanwhile, The Atlantic published a counterpiece titled, "Not Performance Proof: Jasmine Crockett and the Politics of Unburied Memory." The essay argued that the hearing had become the most important civics lesson aired on live television since Watergate. It traced the genealogy of Jasmine's argument back through Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, and the decades of whitewashed curricula that followed. To say she performed is to admit you've never seen a black woman allowed to speak uninterrupted, the article read. To call her theatrical is to admit you've forgotten what moral clarity sounds like. But not all the reactions were ideological. Some were deeply personal and quietly seismic. Nicole Hannah-Jones, creator of the very 1619 Project Under Attack, tweeted only one thing: "I've waited my whole life to hear that in a government building." A Oprah Winfrey called Jasmine that evening. The message was short, emotional, private, but her team leaked one line. "You didn't just testify, you brought the ghosts with you and made them speak." Meanwhile, Cotton doubled down. That night, in an appearance on a conservative podcast, he dismissed the leaked email as selectively edited and labeled the backlash a coordinated smear effort by leftist media elites. But there was a flicker, just a flicker, of something different behind his tone. Exhaustion, or maybe recognition. Not that he had lost, but that he had finally been seen. Still, his base stood by him. Fundraising emails went out with subject lines like "Fight back against the 1619 takeover" and "Stop Crockett's radical history." Within 24 hours, Cotton's PACs reported a $1.2 million surge in donations. Meanwhile, Jasmine's office crashed from email volume. Thousands of letters, stories, invitations, threats, endorsements, hate mail, scholarship requests, offers to help. Digitize the letter she had read aloud. She was being pulled in every direction. But she didn't respond right away. Not to interviews, not to offers, not even to MSNBC's request for a primetime sit-down. Because in her world, this wasn't over. She knew what the cameras wouldn't show. The staffers who cried in the elevator. The security guard who whispered, "My grandmother would have wanted me to thank you." The Republican senator who didn't say a word but left behind a note on hotel stationery in her committee folder. "My grandfather's ledger says item number 9. No signature, just acknowledgement. And that, for Jasmine, was enough for now, because the truth wasn't just a statement she made in that room. It was a living thing now. A fault line running through the country, exposing not just the fracture between left and right, but between those who wanted to remember and those who wanted to forget. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't chasing applause. She was chasing a reckoning, one that didn't end with a headline, one that didn't fit into a chyron, one that, if done right, would force this country not to choose sides, but to face itself. But truth, once unleashed, rarely returns to its cage. And Jasmine Crockett hadn't just pulled back a curtain, she'd torn down a wall. In the days following the hearing, as media networks battled for narrative control and the public split between reverence and rage, a deeper rumble was already starting beneath the Capitol dome. Not a scandal, not a soundbite, but something far rarer, a shift in political will. Quiet at first, reluctant, but real. On the fourth morning, beneath low winter light and tight, security, Congress reconvened. And on the agenda was something that hadn't been seriously touched in over a generation. The National Framework for Teaching Racial History in American Public Schools. The hearing room was different now. More crowded, more cameras, more tension, But it wasn't just journalists packing the benches. It was teachers, civil rights attorneys, museum curators, students flown in from districts fighting to keep race from being erased from their textbooks. They came not as activists, but as witnesses. People tired of being treated like history was something to be negotiated rather than revealed. At the center of it all sat a new subcommittee, hastily formed but sharply defined, the Congressional Task Force on Historical Equity and Education. And Jasmine Crockett had been asked, not without controversy, to co-chair it. She hadn't planned to. She hadn't asked to. But after her confrontation with Cotton lit up the nation's political nerve, the calls came, not from pundits, but from principals, from librarians in Alabama, from parents in Tulsa, from students in South Carolina emailing scanned pages of textbooks that still called slaves unpaid workers. So she said yes. And now she sat in the same building, facing the same institution that once tried to define patriotism without pain. But this time, the script had changed. The hearing opened not with pleasantries, but pressure. Representative Greg Stanton of Arizona leaned forward, his voice dry but direct. "Let's be clear," he said, holding up a worn social studies textbook from 2004. "This is still being taught in over 2,000 school districts. This book doesn't mention redlining, doesn't mention Tulsa, doesn't mention Japanese internment. It calls slavery a form of labor with disadvantages." He placed the book down with deliberate weight. What exactly are we so afraid of our children learning? Then came the flood. Testimony from a Mississippi teacher who'd been suspended for assigning Toni Morrison's Beloved, a superintendent from Virginia who faced death threats for defending the right to teach about Jim Crow, a high school junior. From Florida, who read aloud a passage from her current textbook that described the Civil War as a conflict of differing economic philosophies. And then the question turned back to Jasmine. She didn't bring a folder this time. No letters. No documents. Just a single photograph. She held it up. It showed a black boy, maybe 8 years old, standing beside a school display titled Founding Fathers. The captions beneath the portraits were covered in sticky notes. One said, "Owned 123 people." Another, "Never freed his slaves." The teacher had been fired the next day. Jasmine placed the photo face up on the table. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but made of steel. "We punish truth-tellers in our classrooms. We erase suffering to protect comfort, and we do it in the name of unity." She looked around the room, not for approval, but for accountability. But history doesn't need to be safe. It needs to be honest. Her words didn't rise. They didn't need to. Everyone in the room remembered what she had done 2 weeks earlier. And now, instead of applause, she was answered by something far rarer in Washington: momentum. Within hours, the debate spread to the Senate floor. Bills were dusted off. Amendments proposed. One group called for a Truth and Curriculum Act, mandating the inclusion of primary source narratives from enslaved people, indigenous leaders, and civil rights movements. Another offered a counter, the Historical Integrity Act, arguing for the preservation of founding values against divisive ideologies. The battle lines were drawn again, and once again, Jasmine stood in the crosshairs. This time, it wasn't just Cotton. Senator Josh Hawley took to the floor, claiming Crockett's task force was smuggling critical race theory into the bloodstream of American children. Senator Marsha Blackburn accused her of politicizing grief to indoctrinate classrooms. Jasmine didn't respond with fire. She responded with fact. She returned to the committee with a 42-page proposal backed by over 300 historians from institutions across the country: Harvard, Howard, Georgetown, Spelman, and even West Point. It wasn't radical. It wasn't even new. It called for one thing: that America teach its full story, not just the triumphs, but the costs. Not just who wrote the laws, but who lived beneath them. That hearing was different. No viral moments, no shouting, just quiet resistance and careful courage. But then came a twist. In the third week of testimony, an unexpected voice appeared on the witness list: Representative Adam Kinzinger, a Republican. His testimony was short, direct, devastating. When I was a kid, I was taught that America was always the hero, always right, and I wanted to believe that. But history is not a campaign ad. It's a record. We owe it to our children not to lie to them just because we're afraid of the truth. The room didn't cheer. It stood. And Jasmine Crockett, sitting across from him, didn't smile. But her eyes softened just slightly, because she knew what it took for someone to cross that line. Not just politically, but personally. By months. And the committee had drafted what would become the most controversial education bill since No Child Left Behind. It was called the American Memory Act. Its core tenets were simple. Mandatory inclusion of first-person narratives from enslaved Americans in U.S. history curricula. Federal funding for schools to access digitized records from underrepresented communities. And protection for teachers who teach verified, historically accurate material regardless of political backlash. Cotton called it a Trojan horse for shame. MSNBC called it the first serious attempt at historical reckoning in public education. And Jasmine? She just called it a start, because she knew this wasn't a victory. Not yet. This was the middle of the movie, the part where the storm is clearing just enough to reveal how much damage it's done. The part where people begin to ask not just what went wrong, but what had been wrong all along. And for the first time in decades, the halls of Congress echoed not with ideology, but with questions that could no longer be ignored. What does it mean to teach the truth in a country still fighting over who owns it? What happens when the children begin to ask what the adults tried to forget? And what kind of nation are we building if our memory is edited to fit comfort? But even as the committee debated the language of memory, and the Senate chamber twisted itself into new ideological knots, something else was taking shape outside the walls of Congress. Something Jasmine never anticipated. Because while policies were slow and opposition was loud, the people were still listening. Not just voters or teachers or historians, but storytellers, archivists, publishers, those who understood that sometimes the only way to move a Bell Nation forward is to write it down, word by word, line by line, exactly as it happened. It started with a single email, then a phone call, then a private meeting in a small office 2 blocks from the Capitol, where Jasmine Crockett sat across from one of the most respected nonfiction editors in New York. "We don't want a memoir," the woman said plainly. "We want the transcript." Jasmine blinked. "You mean the hearing?" "Every word," the editor said. "Unabridged, uncut, annotated, yes. Introduced absolutely, but not rewritten, not polished. We want the fire as it happened. The hearing wasn't just politics, it was a reckoning, and America needs a permanent record." Jasmine said nothing for a moment. Her instinct was caution. After all, the hearing had made her a target. The mail still came, some of it filled with thanks, others with venom. She'd been called brave. She'd been called dangerous. And she'd been called every name that clings. To a black woman who refuses to make herself smaller for peace's comfort. Putting it all in print meant one thing: no more room to be misquoted. But it also meant no more room to be erased. She signed the deal the next day. The book would be called Necessary for Who? A title pulled directly from the signs held in nationwide protests after Cotton's 2020 quote resurfaced. A phrase that had once been shouted in outrage would now sit in gold foil font across bookstore windows. A question that had haunted every generation of the oppressed would now become the frame for a national dialogue. The process began immediately. The raw transcripts were brutal, unfiltered, and Jasmine insisted they remain so. Every interruption, every gavel bang, every moment of silence between Elsie Freeman's voice and Tom Cotton's unraveling, all of it would be there. But alongside it, there would be footnotes, essays, scans of the original letters from enslaved Americans, testimonies from students who read about the hearing and wrote essays that their teachers had been told not to assign. It would be more than a book. It would be a counter-history, a weapon made of paper. The backlash came fast. The Wall Street Journal ran an editorial titled, Crockett's Courtroom for the Woke, Publishing Rage as Legacy. Senator Cotton himself tweeted, "Turning propaganda into publishing doesn't make it truth. It makes it a product." But what he didn't understand was that truth had always been a product. One shaped, sold, and censored for centuries. And once, someone like Jasmine was producing it on her terms. The publishing house received threats. Local bookstores reported calls warning them not to carry it. School boards, before the book was even released, circulated preemptive bans. That only made it sell faster. Before it even hit shelves, Necessary for Who became the most pre-ordered nonfiction political book of the year. Not because it was marketed like a celebrity memoir, but because it wasn't a memoir. It was a confrontation, bound in hardcover, page-numbered, indexed, and impossible to ignore. The first chapter, item number 7. The second, the silence between sentences. The final, Necessary for Who, a letter to the unnamed. In between were court transcripts, personal essays, and one particularly gutting piece written by Jasmine titled, "Inheritance Doesn't Always Look Like Property." It spoke of her grandfather, never wealthy, never recorded in newspapers, but a man who once sat her down after school and said, "Just because they won't teach it doesn't mean it didn't happen." The book launch wasn't a party. It was a reading held in the same chamber where the hearing took place. Jasmine stood alone at the center. No backdrop, no podium, just a single light above and a wooden chair beside her. That chair was empty. Symbolically, deliberately. "I was going to ask someone to sit there," she told the crowd. "Maybe a student, maybe a teacher, maybe Mrs. Freeman." She paused. "But then I realized that chair doesn't belong to a person. It belongs to all the people we were never allowed to quote." And then she opened to page 237 and read aloud a line from Cotton's final rebuttal. "I protect America." Then turned the page and read her reply. "I do too, but I don't choose the easy parts to protect." The silence afterward felt different this time. Not stunned, not cautious, but charged, like the room understood, maybe for the first time, that this wasn't about a bill or a headline or a party line. This was about memory. By the end of the week, Necessary for Who had been excerpted. In the New Yorker, cited in a federal education policy debate, and read aloud in classrooms from Oakland to Boston. High school teachers wrote lesson plans overnight. Churches invited readings. Veterans groups ordered bulk copies to learn what we fought to protect. And in a moment few had seen coming, the Library of Congress reached out. They wanted a signed first edition for permanent inclusion in the Civil Rights Archive. It was the first time a sitting member of Congress had written a full public hearing into the historical record, unedited and without institutional filter. Jasmine didn't celebrate. She didn't throw a launch tour. She didn't pose for glamour photos. Instead, she returned to the committee chamber late at night, alone, and sat in the witness chair. She opened the book, flipped to the section with Mrs. Freeman's testimony, and read it again slowly under the light with no one watching. Then she whispered into the silence, "We wrote it down." And this time, she knew it would stay written. 6 months had passed. Not enough time to heal a nation, but just enough to test whether the fire Jasmine Crockett lit would survive the cold machinery of politics. It did. And in the most unlikely of places, a public school district in northern Texas, just 200 miles from where her own journey into law and activism had begun. The school board meeting that night wasn't supposed to make headlines. It was item 7 on a long agenda, tucked between budget proposals and cafeteria contracts. But by the time the gavel struck, the gymnasium had become standing room only. Teachers, students, custodians, veterans, and pastors sat shoulder to shoulder in folding chairs. Some held laminated printouts of Jasmine's quotes. Others clutched history books with sticky notes peeking out, pages they now questioned, truths they had begun to uncover. When the board president read the final vote aloud, 7-0, the crowd didn't erupt. It rose slowly, in silence, as if standing was the only response worthy of the moment. The district's central library, once named for a Civil War general, was officially renamed the Jasmine Crockett Justice Library. Outside, the new sign was unveiled beneath the glow of stadium lights. The metal letters shone like a verdict. Bold, unflinching, permanent. Students gathered beneath it for selfies. Parents wiped away tears. And one retired teacher whispered, "We finally told the truth on a building." But not everyone was celebrating. At a press conference in Little Rock, Tom Cotton stood behind a podium bearing a crisp new logo. A white eagle against a black background, its wings drawn back, not soaring, but clenched. Below it, his campaign slogan, "Restore Truth." He spoke with the rhythm of a man rehearsed, but rattled. "What we're seeing across this country," he began, "is a dangerous attempt to rewrite our founding values, to divide our classrooms, our communities, and our children. We don't need revision. We need restoration. We need to get back to truth. Real truth." He didn't mention Jasmine by name. He didn't have to. The dog whistle had become a bullhorn. Networks loyal to his message picked it up immediately. Chirons flashed. Cotton launches war on woke history. Senator, truth is not a feeling. The phrase "restore truth" trended within hours, but so did its rebuttal. Whose truth? Nasham's Jasmine Crockett Library, and necessary for who? The divide was no longer theoretical. It was geographical, generational, spiritual, and at its center stood a 619-page congressional transcript, a courtroom confrontation gone viral, and a woman who had never expected to become a symbol, but refused to become a footnote. And then, quietly, something extraordinary happened. The Library of Congress updated its homepage. There, beside collections on Lincoln and Douglas, beneath a rotating banner on Reconstruction documents, sat a new feature. A scanned, yellowing letter, written in cursive by a 98-year-old woman named Elsie Freeman. The headline was simple. Featured document. A letter from Mrs. Freeman. The letter, addressed to the children I'll never meet, read, "They will tell you history must be saved. But history is not drowning. It is buried. It does not need salvation. It needs uncovering. It needs breath. It needs to be held up to the light and spoken in full, even when it makes people shift in their seats, especially then." And at the bottom, in a trembling yet steady hand, history does not need to be saved. It needs to be told completely. Within 24 hours, the library's website crashed under the weight of traffic. Schools printed the letter and framed it. Teachers read it aloud over morning announcements. Some churches replaced their Sunday sermon readings with it. And perhaps most stunningly, a Republican congressman from Ohio quoted it on the House floor, saying, "Even when I disagree with the messengers, I can't ignore the message." Jasmine saw the letter late one evening, long after her final meeting. She was alone in her office, a single desk lamp casting shadows across stacks of books, letters, and media requests she hadn't yet answered. She clicked the link. At first, she smiled, then her eyes filled with something harder to name. Not pride, not grief, but confirmation that this fight, born of centuries, carried by grandmothers who weren't allowed to read or write, now lived. In pixels and ink, in legislation and street signs, in classrooms and libraries and homepages that used to overlook women like Elsie Freeman. She closed her laptop and whispered, "They're still listening." But elsewhere, the storm was rebuilding. Cotton's campaign was gaining steam. Billionaires lined up behind him. Educational PACs flooded battleground states with ads warning of indoctrination and division. His slogan, "Restore Truth," became a rallying cry at school board meetings where teachers were shouted down and Holocaust comparisons were thrown like darts. But a quieter movement grew alongside it. In Tulsa, a 6th grade history teacher assigned "Necessary for Who" as optional reading and ended up with 33 essays turned in voluntarily. In New Jersey, a group of librarians created a nationwide digital archive of suppressed curriculum materials titled the Freeman Files. And in that Texas district, the one that had renamed its library, students began a new annual tradition, Peter, reading of Elsie Freeman's letter every February, broadcast across the entire district. This wasn't a victory lap. It was the beginning of something Jasmine Crockett had come to understand as more powerful than applause: persistence. Because in a country always tempted to forget, she had helped it remember. And now the reckoning had a name, a book, a building, and a letter too honest to be ignored. And as the camera lights faded, as the hashtag slowed, and the news cycles moved on, what remained was not the noise, but the lesson. It didn't arrive in the thunder of applause or the final swing of a gavel. It came later, quietly, in the spaces between headlines, in classrooms where students whispered, "I didn't know that," in dinner tables where grandfathers paused, remembering things they'd once been told to forget, in the quiet realization that truth, once spoken, doesn't need permission to keep echoing. The lesson was this: that justice is not always loud, but it is always earned. That it takes more courage to tell the truth about who we've been than to pretend we've always been who we claim to be. And that history is not a finished book. It is an unfinished trial, one where the witnesses are still stepping forward, and the verdict is not yet written. Jasmine Crockett didn't stand to be admired. She stood because silence had failed too many before her. She stood because someone had to say it out loud, on record, without flinching. The injustice she faced was never just political. It was ancestral. It was woven into the very institutions she was elected to challenge. And yet, she never asked for sympathy, only accountability. Because she understood what many still refuse to admit, that patriotism without honesty is performance, that legacy without truth is theft, that progress without memory is a lie with better lighting. The human lesson wasn't just that one voice can disrupt power. It was that power fears memory more than rebellion because memory makes the invisible visible. It gives names to item number 7. It writes letters from women like Elsie and refuses to let them fade. It places those stories where even history books once said, "Not important." And it dares to say, "We're still here." In the end, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a debate. She altered the terrain. She proved that the most radical act in America today is to remember fully, not selectively, not conveniently, but completely. Because when a country remembers everything, it cannot deny anyone. And when it denies no one, it finally begins to become the promise written in its founding words. Not just for some, but for all. That is the lesson. And that is why it matters. Because in a nation still haunted by the stories it buries, one woman opened the file, held it up to the light, and said, "You don't get to skip this chapter. You live in it." Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.